internet. Today we're going to be talking about psychotherapy for classic autism, also called Kanner syndrome, and it's a form of autism that often comes with intellectual disability, which means that the individual might not be able to read, write, understand complex ideas, not be able sometimes to plan on a multiple step ahead, and so on and so forth. So these are typically the people that need the more help, or the most help and adaptations, and basically support out of all the autistic individuals and on the spectrum. So they're the ones that are the most vulnerable. So for many decades now, the main form of therapy that was offered to them was an educational or re-educational therapy like ABA or TITCH, in which the idea is to try and make them understand the social settings, codes, and try and basically make them abide by the mold of society, which is something I personally disagree with a lot, because for many reasons I think that this is not the only method that should be used. So I'm not going to go into the whole controversy surrounding these methods because, and I have to be completely honest with you, psychoanalysis has its controversies as well. I mean, we're not that much better in terms of taking care of autistic people, but nevertheless, I think that our psychoanalytic methods still have a lot of value for these people. And I'm going to try and explain why, and I'm going to try and explain how it might work, or at least how I try and make it work. So, very simply, these people that have issues communicating, issues verbalizing what they're feeling, that those issues do not mean that they're not feeling, that they're not experiencing the world on a certain level of emotional layers. However, because they can't express it or they can't show it, people are quick to dismiss that aspect of them, which means that for a long time the main theory was that autistic people or classic autistic people did not have empathy, that they were devoid of that, that they didn't understand others, that they had lack in the theory of mind, meaning they really weren't able to understand what was going on in the minds of others. But recently it has been challenged by the idea, and which I really like, of Markham, which basically says that no, it's not that they don't understand, it's quite the opposite. They're hypersensitive, they're so sensitive that they have an intense relationship to the world, therefore they withdraw within themselves to protect themselves. And I think, coming from a psychoanalytic perspective, this is brilliant, because in my personal clinical experience with classic autism, it's exactly that. The autistic people know very well what is happening around them. It's just that they don't necessarily want to talk about it, or they don't want to share it because they might be very afraid of their own inner emotions. And therefore, the whole job of the clinical psychologist is to try, or the psychotherapist, is to try and make those people slowly but surely have the will or the energy to communicate what's going on within them. It's a very arduous process, as they have often a whole layer of defense mechanisms against that, because they're afraid of being overwhelmed. So the question might be, yes, but if they're non-verbal? Well, if they're non-verbal, everything I just said still applies, right? It doesn't go away. But you might have to find a way of communicating with them through another medium. For example, Play-Doh, clay, water, drawing, painting. All of these things are so important because there are ways for the autistic individual to express themselves. And often they do very meaningful works of art, right? Because they are showing a part of their inner world. And that inner world is a very important matter. However, unlike most patients, interpretations on autistic people, psychoanalytic interpretations like, oh, I think you might be sad, or I think that basically you are trying to tell me something do not really work, or they only work basically in an after effect, but not on the get-go. The autistic classical autism is very interesting in this regard, because basically on the surface they might seem that they're unreceptive, but at the core they still have a form of transference to the therapist, but it's just more of a hidden transference that they're not going to show. And what is fundamentally interesting and I think important is to respect the timing, because the time in canon autism is going to be very slow. It's going to be touch by touch. What is very important to keep in mind is that nothing can be changed massively. The things have to be always very respected in their temporality, meaning that if there's a symptom that they suffer from, they might not want necessarily a heavy hitting interpretation. They might, on the contrary, want the clinician to be very, very slow, very, very gentle. Also, what I have found is that they have a lot of interpersonal defenses in which they will not necessarily recognize their own emotions, or at least, and this is important, they will not agree with the clinician when they will give an interpretation on their feelings. Not because the clinician is necessarily wrong, but because they don't want to share that, because that's already being too vulnerable. It's already taking the risk of being engulfed by one's emotions because it's so intense. But what I found very interesting is that if the clinician is to qualify the feelings of someone else, let's say your mother or father felt that way, then the classic autistic individual can say, yes, mom was sad, or dad sad. And it's very important, and I always found that interesting because it does show that they are observant and intuitive. It's just that they don't want to have that gaze on them, and I think that that's often what pushes them to withdraw and to put the clinician at a certain distance. Emotionally, it's because it's too much, and often the fact is that they will sometimes oppose a clinician in a very stubborn way, because what they want is, more often than not, to be able to live their lives far away without any form of intrusiveness. Because that's, I think, one of the big issues, is that educative techniques can sometimes be very intrusive in the subjectivity of an autistic person, because that subjectivity is something that's very subtle, very fragile, and yet very, very interesting. Every detail is there, and often they're very meticulous individuals and very precise individuals, meaning that they know what they're doing and they know why they're doing it. They might not want to share why they're doing it, but they know. And often I think the whole perspective of a clinician is to build a rapport with the autistic person. And I think that in psychotherapy, often we want to see progress, but progress in autism looks different. It's not about the diminishing of certain symptoms like stereotypies or idiosyncratic verbalizations. For example, if they say and repeat the same words, but it's more about gaining some form of understanding and some form of basically shared experience. Something that I think works incredibly well is sometimes to play at imitating the autistic individual, being like a mirror to them. Often they feel very amused by that. And slowly but surely they will be able to start sharing with the clinician certain of their inner subjectivity or their representations of the world. For example, they might be able to share with the clinician how a relative died. Like, for example, they might say to the clinician, she was up, she fell, dead. And the more the rapport is built, the more they're going to be able to share that subjectivity. And the same story might be told again and again and again, but always with little more details, always with more subtleties, always with a little something else. It makes it not exactly what it was the week before. And what I found very interesting is also the repetition of temporality. What I mean by that is that often it's like Monday is Monday and it always happens in the same way. Tuesday is Tuesday and it always happens in the same way, etc., etc. As if the events that happen on Tuesday will happen for every Tuesday. For example, we went on the swimming pool on Tuesday, then for all the Tuesdays are going to be swimming pools. That form of ritualization is also helped when the therapist offers a fixed hour for the patient. That the patient knows that, for example, I don't know, let's say on Fridays 1 p.m., that's the therapist time. And that helps the patient build an understanding of what's going to happen. And often they might not share what they're living through or what they're experiencing, but you have to trust them that it is very useful to them, because often they can afterwards say to people, it helps me because when I'm angry I can draw. It helps me because when I'm sad I can sculpt clay. And you might not know it because they won't tell you directly, even if you ask, but it's very useful. And I think that the main problem nowadays is that we are not considering the subjectivity of classical autism. We are just seeing it as something to be fixed or mitigated in the damages it does to an infant, as if autism was a disease that were to be stopped, when in a way it's a fundamental difference in subjectivity and in the way of perceiving the world. And that's something that I think is very important, and that's why psychodynamics still seems to me so important. Of course, and this is going to be very important, where I find that there are limits to psychodynamics is in the question of etiology, i.e., where does it come from? I think that that was our downfall in terms of psychoanalysis. It's because we insisted on this theory of the mother refrigerator, which was conceptualized but disavowed quickly by Kanner, but taken by Bruno Bettelheim, that made a whole basically book, which in French is called La Forteresse du Vide, which is the empty fortress or void fortress. I don't know how they translated it in English, but and he saw his experience as a concentration camp survivor similar to an autistic person. Therefore, there was this idea that the autistic person, in psychoanalysis at least, became autistic because of a calmness of the mother. So this is, I think, where it all falls down, because I don't think that you can do a one-to-one. Of course, certain autistic people have mothers that were emotionally detached or depressed or whatever. That is possible. It's not. But to say that it causes autism, I think is a step too far. It's much more complicated, subtle, and I think refined than that. And this is, I think, where I personally separate with psychoanalysis, in the fact that I don't think that finding etiology is useful for the clinician, nor for the patient, and nor for the environment, i.e. the family. What is important is the lived experience in the now. What is important is what has hurt in the past. For example, if the autistic individual has lost people, they might need to grieve in their own specific way, and they might defend against that grief in a very specific way. But they still need to experience it on some level. And often the work with them as a clinician is often very, how can I say, very mysterious in the ways that we don't really know what works. We might say things that will trigger very deep emotions, things that seem trivial. And there might be other times where we think that we've said something incredibly deep and then it triggers no reaction, at least not on the surface. And we might feel at a loss and a strange feeling that nothing works. But it doesn't mean that it's true. It means that sometimes I think we lose hope because we don't see change, because the autistic individual often is built to try and preserve the same frame as possible, to avoid change at all costs. And something of us becomes desperate for change. But it's something that's very interesting, because often when the clinician starts to really get doubtful, often something changes, a little something in the relationship, showing that the autistic individual is fully aware that some things have to change, and perhaps even that it's good for the relationship to change from time to time. And sometimes they will initiate that change when the rapport is good enough, when the transference and countertransference is good enough. I also should say that the analysis of transference might be limited, but the analysis of countertransference, i.e., how a clinician feels, is immense and so useful in autism, because so many things are gonna transit through projective identifications, through imitations, through feelings of hope, and then sadness of the clinician, or sometimes feelings of boredom, and all of these things can be interpreted and restituted to the person with autism. But of course, as always with countertransference, it has to be subtly done, and really, it's really a precision procedure, right? It's not like you give them, like, I was bored last night, or I was bored last time we saw each other, and so on and so forth. Of course not. But you might say things like, oh, well, sometimes I have the feeling that I'm talking all by myself. And the autistic person might answer, yes, you're talking all by yourself, because I'm not listening. And some things can be interesting in this regard. Of course, here I'm making it out that they're all verbal. Some of them are non-verbal. In these cases, it becomes even trickier because you really don't know what helps. But often what I saw is that when they're willing to come back, it means that something is at play, something is working, and they're working in psychotherapy. It's just we don't know exactly how. And I understand that in nowadays where science has become sacred, we need to know exactly what is working and what isn't, and therefore it's what I am presenting here seems a little out of date or a little passé, but I do strongly believe that autistic people do benefit from psychotherapy. And I'm not saying necessarily psychoanalysis per se, but I am talking about talk therapy, about being able to verbalize something, even if it's just a couple of sentences, even if it's in a word, even if it's drawing something. It is so very useful, because often we don't let that space of subjectivity come forward, or we don't even think that it's possible that they have it, because we feel that they are too limited or too stuck in their own world. But that's the whole point of psychotherapy, that we can show the team in institutions, the families, the environment on the whole, that no, this person has a subjective experience and it is worthwhile investigating, and therefore it is important to do so. And in my eyes, the process with the autistic person is going to be always chronic, i.e., it's going to be continuous, and the symptoms will evolve very slowly, but progress is made. The person can feel happier, and they can feel more able to communicate, or sometimes more able to tell you when to back off. And this is great, this is important. It's not magical, it won't cure autism, of course not, but it can help the autistic individual see their emotions, understand them, verbalize them, and also tell people to back off when needed, meaning that they can defend themselves better. And that I really do believe in it, in that it's very, very valuable experience for autistic people. And also, and this is important, it gives them, for lack of a better word, a comrade in life, because often they are isolated, especially when they're non-verbal. But having someone that they see every day, be it the psychologist, the psychiatrist, the nurse, the helper, having people around them, with them, also helps them, because they're not alone and they feel that they can talk, or at least try and communicate at their pace, not at the pace of the outside world, not because the outside world wants them to or asks them to, but because they can do it, they can choose, they can be there when they want to be there, and they can basically withdraw within themselves when they need to withdraw, without any repercussions, without the therapist getting angry, without the therapist trying to dig deeper, and so on and so forth. And I think that unfortunately we are very in terms of society, we are very, very prone to just dismiss that as they're unattainable. We've lost them. We haven't lost them. Quite the opposite. They've always been there, and they feel, and they're there, and psychotherapy can help them have someone to share all of those feelings with, or at least a fraction of those feelings, and perhaps even sometimes grow as people. And that I am fully convinced. And this has basically been the whole point of this video, is to say that psychotherapy, talk therapy for non-verbal or can autistic people is possible, and it's worthwhile, even though it's not necessarily what is a la mode right in our day and age, but I still strongly believe it, and I still see the value of it on a clinical level. This is pretty much it. I know that this may be more bizarre than the other videos I've done on psychotherapy, but I think it's still very valuable. So if you have any questions, put them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.